Let's see. Michael Levin. Well, he talked with Carl Friston 5 days ago is when the video was posted. I think that's gotta be what I'll watch here. I spoke with Carl Friston 2 months ago too. If they speak regularly, then I suppose the most recent one Nah, let's go with the most recent one.
I think, I'm a biologist, so Chris and Carl don't know me. I'm a biologist, and my area of specialization is, broadly speaking, chemical ecology and toxinology. And, I'd like to get to that area, sort of my comfort zone, and maybe talk about things like the generation of novelty, things like generative noise, molecular babbling, exaptation, improvisation, play, all of these things. That's kind of my comfort zone, and I'd like to get to talking about that sort of thing, in the context of the free energy principle and how the free energy principle really approaches the genesis of novelty. But I would like to do the slightly more risky thing, at least for me, especially given my current state, and begin with physics and indeed even metaphysics. So I'd like to sort of motivate an argument toward in support of a realistic and I've been using the term constructive realism in some of the discussions with Mike, a realistic interpretation of the free energy principle. And I think this is, correct me if I'm wrong, it feels like there is a sort of controversy surrounding this, and the concern that the FEP might have some anti-realist leanings, and there are also warnings, of course, Mel Andrews' fantastic paper, "The Math is Not the Territory." There are worries about a certain literalism that might come along with a realistic framing of the FEP. So I want to kind of look at how we can avoid that kind of literalism, but also not slide into anti-realism and not be sort of giving an account of, say, and I mean, I'll use this term under advisement, referencing both Anil Seth, but also, I suppose, you, Carl, not giving an account where we say things like perception is 100% hallucinatory or something like that. And maybe we can be illusionists of a kind, and we can preserve the fact that, we're subject to delusion. There is a hallucinatory aspect to perception, but still couch that in a kind of realistic framework. And so I'd like to kind of get there by talking about kind of coarse graining as a fundamental physical principle, and really looking at the FEP itself as a description, as a formal framework which describes coarse graining. And I think one of the probably the fundamental challenges that a lot of people have with the FEP and the FEP literature is that there are, I mean, it's not just math heavy, right? It's got all of these different analogical formalisms in a certain sense. You know, they kind of seem to come from different areas of physics, but be describing essentially the same kind of process. So the process is perhaps quite simple in its essence, but there are lots of different ways of cashing it out formally. I mean, maybe I'll stop waffling. Does that sound like a reasonable thing to say?
From my perspective, yes. I mean, you've touched on 101 issues there. So this is yeah. I think there's definitely two separate conversations. You know, the philosophical interpretation of the free energy principle, or more specifically, the application of that kind of principle in different domains, and then the intriguing problem of novelty and play and exploration and model building and exploring various structures. So I think the first issue, I mean, you very nicely scaffolded the issues. I think most of them, from a physics perspective, could be fairly easily resolved, if not dissolved. Having said that, you're going to have to be very careful in explaining terms that are not familiar to me. I have no foundational training in philosophy, so you know, a lot of these distinctions I find entertaining, but you know, very often I regard this as a spectator sport. It doesn't so much affect the application of the free energy principle. So my normal line in this kind of conversation would be: the free energy principle is just a principle, read as a physics principle. That means it's a method. So all you do is apply it. You don't argue about it, or you can, but you know, it's there to be used. It's not there to be the target of philosophy papers. How might you apply it? Well, you can apply it in many different ways, and the utility of having that principle at hand is that now you can effectively reproduce or simulate sentient kind of self-organization, or at least that now you can effectively reproduce or simulate sentient kind of self-organization, or at least well, first of all, it equips you with an interpretation that has a teleology in terms of perception and sentience and play and novelty, if you want to go that far. But this is just a license to put a teleology on it in and of itself. The energy principle doesn't appeal to any teleology. It's much more tautological than that. It's a description of things that self-organize. But it's in that deflationary aspect, though, it's important to remember that there is a very practical utility in the free energy principle, because although it describes things that self-organize to some attracting set in the classical formulation of pullback attractor, what you can do when you know the dynamics that underwrite that self-organization is you can write down that attracting set in a computer, which means, or in any artifact in some kind of mortal computation, and then you just specify the dynamics, or you write in the dynamics by applying the free energy principle in terms of gradient flows or fixed point iterations, however you want to pull. In terms of gradient flows or fixed point iterations, however you want to do it, which means in terms of gradient flows or fixed point iterations, however you want to do it, which means that you can build self-organizing systems where you specify the kind of system in terms of the attracting set that you want to reproduce and model. And once you've done that, you can then take that in two directions. You can then either put your teleology on it, So you can wax lyrical about this bacterium's playing, exploring, and you're fully licensed to sort of tell the basal cognition story, which is just a way, from my perspective, of equipping people with intuitions that of a teleological sort, which are not part of the physics, but they're certainly extremely helpful, I think, and allow you to join the dots between different fields and disciplines. On the one hand, or you can actually use effectively the digital twins or the simulation of the system you're interested in as an observation model for some empirical data. So that means that you can take an actual system or a system, the measurements of some system of interest, and then optimize the parameters of effectively your attracting set or your generative model until your simulated system now reproduces what you're observing empirically. And that will be one way of, if you like, reverse engineering the generative model that provides the best account of this particular system. And that is a fairly standard procedure in the cognitive neurosciences, particularly in computational psychiatry. That I get an addict or somebody who's very depressed responding to a well-defined experimental universe or paradigm, and then I model the choices of, which could be novelty seeking, for example, formally defined under the free energy principle. I model the responses under the assumption that this subject is behaving and making decisions under this generative model with these priors, and then I optimize the priors until it reproduces the observed behavior. And that now allows me to phenotype the teleology, if you like, of this decision making formally, by using fairly straightforward procedures. I don't think it's ever been done, but in principle, you could do exactly the same thing for a cell or an organ or something along those lines. So that would be a sort of practical response to the map and the territory. I'm not sure. So literalism, can you explain to me what that means? That means that people think that cells are actually perceiving. Is that the?
I suppose literalism in the broader context, as opposed to where the cells are actually perceiving, would be, maybe another Korzybski aphorism gets at it nicely. So Alfred Korzybski is the one who said the map is not the territory. He also said, whatever I say a thing is, it is not. Literalism is basically taking a representation or a description of something to be the thing itself, essentially, like to map onto it one-to-one. So to say that the model is, in fact, describing exactly the dynamics or whatever of the system that is being modeled, perhaps.
Right. Well, I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but that is certainly not the case for the free energy principle. In the following sense, that in elaborating or deriving the dynamics of any given system, you are and interpreting that in terms of a variation of free energy that plays the role of a bound on the actual probability of occupying certain states. Described in terms of the self-information or if you're a Lagrangian or adaptive fitness, if you wanted to. So that variational bound is assumed to be infinitely tight under the free energy principle. So when there is a departure or a difference between the actual dynamics of the system and its attracting set, and the way that you would write down or describe that attracting set in terms of a probability distribution, which is, you can read it many different ways. It can be this, surprise on the self-information, the negative log preference of the states, negative, a potential based upon states that are valuable to that system, that characterize that system. Then you have to assume that the free energy is equal to the self-information, and then everything else follows. But because the free energy is a bound, then your description of the system, that is just basically evolving to its attracting set, minimizing its thermodynamic free energy, in terms of minimizing a variational free energy, now only becomes a bound approximation. So you can't say that it's doing inference explicitly, because to do inference, there would have to be a gap between the variational free energy and the self-information. However, if you assume that gap is small, you can now say it looks as if this system is making inferences. It looks as if it is self-evidencing. It looks as if it is trying to minimize its variation free energy, or it looks as if it is trying to maximize its marginal likelihood. You can make a move in which you just say stipulatively the generative model of this system is actually its a probabilistic description of an attracting set, and then that teleology becomes exact, but you'll never know what that particular generative model is. So it's a nice philosophical move, but it doesn't help you practically, because the whole point of applying the free energy principle is to reverse engineer the underlying generative model, and thereby equip you with the description, the ability to simulate, reproduce that kind of behavior, and understand it in terms of the priors implicit in that generative model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's all very, very helpful. I think the point that I'm suggesting is that I definitely don't think it's up to you or necessarily anyone who's utilizing the free energy principle in a more or less instrumentalist manner to define an ontology that it corresponds with. But I think there is, a popular discourse and a philosophical discourse, an academic discourse surrounding that ontology. And I think that's inevitable, and especially given that, you make yourself very available for public discussion as well. And in that framework, there's generally a desire to interpret these things in a slightly different manner, and in a potentially in a more realist manner. So to say, well, what does this actually refer to? But I think that even before we dive into, say, words like metaphysics and ontology, and one of the reasons I wanted to return to the basic physics, actually, I wanted to kind of build the story up from dissipative structures. And I know, Chris and well, all of you have published on this quantum dissipative adaptation, but the kind of story that someone like Jeremy England is telling, I'm also relating that to the principle of least action and interpreting these things as constructive. So one of the questions that arises arises for me as an evolutionary biologist, and I think would arise for Mike as a developmental biologist, when you're discussing the free energy principle in precisely the terms that you were just discussing it, and talking about how, once you have defined this and you can write down this attracting set, you can talk about the behavior of this entity in relation to this attracting set. We do want to know, where does the attracting set comes from in a certain sense, right? That is what evolutionary biology and really developmental biology are. That's what biology is all about, So we do want to. So even before we are being, strictly speaking, philosophical with a capital P, or making our living in philosophy departments, we're asking these sorts of explanatory questions. We're asking these sorts of why questions. And when we find a principle like the free energy principle, a formal framework like the free energy principle, useful and applicable, apt in some way. So, we can go back to saying the map is not the territory, sure, but there are good maps and bad maps, So if the free energy principle is apt in some way, what is that saying about the kinds of dynamics that it is describing, and how can that potentially be plugged into an explanatory model? And you've published a number of papers, and I know Mike and Chris have as well, on the basic isomorphism between the free energy the basic logic of the free energy principle and, say, the logic of natural selection. And also, you've defined them both as principles of least action. And I think we should note, right, that the natural selection is taken to be an explanatory principle. And the principle of least action is essentially an ecological principle, right? It's about how the environment determines the principle, the path of least action. And so I think I'm just suggesting that if we take the kind of constructive logic that we find in evolutionary biology, this attempt to explain the forms or explain the attracting sets, and we're making attracting sets equivalent to paths of least action, essentially, right? I think in the FEP, in the sort of path-dependent way of thinking about the FEP, those are equivalent. We do want to ask this basic evolutionary and ecological question, which is not confined just to biology now. We're thinking about, generative constructive process in evolutionary terms, and we're thinking about a relational landscape in terms of ecology. So generalizing those notions, and we're asking how the free energy principle, I suppose, which appears to describe those things perfectly, appears to be, a beautiful way of describing those things. How that aligns with our aspirations for having explanatory, for gaining explanatory knowledge through frameworks like this, and how. I think, I've heard you be asked the question a number of times and comment on the question a number of times. Something like, why do you speak about latent or hidden variables as opposed to just appearances? This is another way people try to draw you into philosophical conversations about realism, I know. And this is essentially the same kind of question, because we're talking about what is the actual environment, the real environment that is then defining the attracting set, defining the landscape, and its energy minima, and therefore its paths of least action. And so I suppose all I'm getting at here is that the FEP does seem ripe for, and again, I'm not suggesting that it's your task to provide that, but does seem ripe for a kind of realist ontology that fits with this basically ecological and evolutionary framing of it.
Yes, I agree entirely. So I'm going to stop talking now because I'm sure Chris and Mike have lots of things to say. But yeah, that relational aspect, and I think the phrase that comes to mind is the scale invariant aspect of applying the FEP, and that's I'm sure Chris will have something to say about this. So the phenotyping context. What is the context? Well, the context itself in a scale-free or in the spirit of the renormalization group should also be amenable to application of the free energy principle, and that basically induces now a kind of, let's say, George Ellis-like top-down and bottom-up causation. And to me, that's the most important relational aspect. I mean, there are lots of really important relational aspects in terms of ensemble self-organization, between cells at any particular space-time scale. But I think the deeper question you're speaking to is much more of a scaling issue. Again, looked at from the point of view of the renormalization group, and is how does the free energy minimizing process, which could be natural selection or Bayesian model selection, if you like, how does that contextualize the play of a phenotype with its conspecifics or exploring its environment, and how does the environment perceive perceive in a literalist sense, perceive the phenotypes that are co-constructing that environment. So I think that those issues, are, if you like, that those issues, or perhaps the frame afforded by a scale invariant, if not scale-free application of the free energy principle, is probably the frame in which you would start to address these deeper questions.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why I like to think of it in terms of course grading, because and course constructive process that actually can occur endogenously. Like if we look at dissipative structures and things like that, it's a sort of it's self-organization in the sense that the environment ends up coarse graining itself in a certain way. So I say endogenous coarse graining, and that gives us an image of how you get a hierarchical structure in a certain sense, right? The nested coarse graining, and that can take us all the way to Mike's polycomputing and collaborative coarse graining in multicellular organisms and all sorts of fascinating stuff there. And I'm going to shut up as well. But the other thing is just to say that if the FEP is completely general and fundamental principle, like a principle of least action, then the environment, of course, we're not only speaking of the environment and its relationship to a particular individual agent that's navigating and finding energy minima and things like that. We're thinking of the way the environment itself is constructed, right? So the environment is constructed in exactly the same way as the organism. And that's why, to get to the origin of novelty thing and drawing a long bow, the landscape is constantly shifting, right? So it shouldn't be thought of, just as natural selection shouldn't be thought of as really an optimality model. It's a local optimality model, but there's no global optimum. The fitness landscape is changing all the time, just as the energy landscape is changing all the time. And that's precisely because every component of the landscape is, continually, trying to find, but also constructing, and that's the active principle and active inference, right? Its own path of least or stationary action. So yeah, be quiet now.
I'll just toss in a couple of comments to what Carl said that I think was very wise, of course. The FEP literary around is deeply at risk of becoming like quantum theory and spawning an entire discipline of interpretation that achieves nothing. And it may just be inevitable. But if one sticks very close to the physics, then what, for example, you referred to as literalism when you were defining it generally, is actually forbidden by the physics. The physics tells us we cannot construct such models in principle. So that issue, in a sense, is entirely made up and is based on the assumption of a kind of epistemic perspective that dates from the early part of the 19th century. And at least since quantum theory is no longer valid, no longer worth considering. And I like this idea of sticking extremely close to the physics, because the physics itself, as you were describing at the very end, has a lot to tell us about this generation of complexity. Mm-hmm. And we have this very common point of view that things start out simple and they get more complicated. And it's not at all clear that that's correct. Things are sort of potentially complicated all the time. And it's a bit of a matter of who's looking and how are they looking to be able to tell just how complicated they are at some particular scale where we're choosing to do some modeling. So I guess I would recommend against trying to get too deep into a philosophical discussion that's motivated by concepts that are actually inconsistent with the physics that's being used to formulate the principle. And one has to get deep into it to see where the inconsistencies are, but that's possible.
I think that that's very good advice, and I fully agree. And actually, I think that it's not only, in a sense, the physics that tells us that such a model is impossible. I think what I was saying about there not being any global optimum. That's an evolutionary principle, and there's a whole branch of epistemology called fallibilism, which is evolutionary epistemology of people like Charles Sanders Peirce and latterly Karl Popper, which really fits with that idea. It's specifically directed against the fallacy of literalism, of imagining that we could ever have a final, perfect map, so to speak. Again, partly because the territory itself is continually changing. But there are, and I also, fully agree with you what you were saying about quantum theory and this profusion of literature on interpretations that maybe doesn't get us anywhere. But I do think, and this is partly just my temperament, that there are ways to do philosophy well, and there are ways to do it poorly. And there are also some great process relational thinkers who in many cases are themselves deeply grounded in mathematics and logic, like Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Sanders Peirce, who come up with systems, very elaborate systems, but that are in many ways strikingly similar to the free energy principle. Also reducible on some level. And I mean, Peirce in particular is extremely explicit about this, that all of logic, according to Peirce, is reducible to his, basic categories of firstness, secondness, and thirdness, right? So, and he takes it to be the task of metaphysics to reduce, to divine or derive some thirdness, reducible at all of logic is also reducible on some level. And I mean, Peirce in particular is extremely explicit about this, that all of logic, according to Peirce, is reducible to his, basic categories of firstness, secondness, and thirdness, right? So, and he takes it to be the task of metaphysics to reduce, divine or derive the most basic set of categories.
Interesting.
Hi, welcome to Philosine. My name is Markus, and on this channel I describe and explore the philosophy and semiotics of Charles Sanders Peirce. In this first video, I describe the three categories that underline the whole philosophy and thinking of Charles Sanders Peirce. So, let's get on to it. So, what are the categories? The categories are a logical way to describe the reality and our experience. The categories can be applied to every kind of phenomena and every kind of reality. So the categories are a tool to help us to categorize, describe, and explain everything that we could possibly experience. A few remarks before we dive into the categories themselves. The categories are very elemental and very basic, and therefore they are quite hard and difficult to explain through language, because our language is not as elemental and basic as the categories. Nevertheless, you will be able to understand the categories better when you relate them to your own personal experience of reality. And one final remark. The categories, as I said, are a logical way to describe reality. So there is a logic behind all of this, which is a subject to another video, but keep that in mind as we go through the categories. So the first category is the category of firstness. Firstness is being without any relation to another. Firstness is pure quality or immediate feeling. Firstness has to be new and fresh, because if it were old, it would already be second to its former state. Firstness has to be free and spontaneous and vivid, because if it were determined by something else, it would also be second to that something else. So it's completely free, and we are never able to really capture firstness and put it in a cage. It always escapes our thinking. Stop to think about it and it's already gone. But in our experience or everyday experiences of firstness are, for example, qualities like colors or smells or sounds, and also feelings that we have. But very good example, in my opinion, of that kind of experience of firstness is this kind of a state between dreaming and being awake. That kind of a delicate state when you're not really dreaming, but you're not really awake. So in that state, you're experiencing all kinds of free and spontaneous qualities and feelings that you're not really sure what they are. You're not thinking, but you're not perceiving things. You're just experiencing this kind of a vague feeling. And as you wake up, or as you stop to think about that kind of an experience, it's already gone. So firstness is very delicate, very hard to describe, because it really escapes our description of it. And in order to perceive firstness, it has to be embodied in something. And for example, in order to perceive a color, that color has to be embodied in something. For example, a piece of cloth or a flower or whatever. And that brings us to the category of secondness. What I forgot to mention is that firstness is also a possibility that can be embodied in something. For example, a color is a possibility that can be embodied in different objects. Secondness is being in relation to another. We confront secondness in concepts like relation to another, or cause and effect, or force and resistance, or action and reaction, or independence from something, or dependence on something. Whereas firstness was this kind of a delicate thing that could not really be described without losing its innocence, secondness is rigid. Secondness is the brute force of reality here and now. Something that's very familiar to us in our experience. For example, on Monday morning, when you're trying to get up from bed, you have to use force against this external resistance. And if we stop to think about it, our whole existence is dependent on effort. Our heart has to pump blood every moment in order for us to even exist. So secondness is this brute force here and now, something that occurs in a moment that we have to acknowledge. For example, a sudden loud noise is something that we just perceive. It just enters our perception and our consciousness, and we cannot choose to ignore it. It has force that we cannot resist. And with secondness, there is also this acknowledgement of otherness, that something is different from me, that there is something that is not my ego, and that there is contrast between things. So we come to a certain point with just two categories. We can describe our experiences with all kinds of binaries, yes and no, first and second, first and last. But at some point, we need to acknowledge that there is something between the absolute first and the absolute last, that there is a continuity or continuum between those two extremes. There is a continuum of possibilities. And that's exactly the category of thirdness, which describes mediation, continuity of our experience, and eventually information. So thirdness is first's relation to second through a third. So in our experience, it is not just composed from singular occurrences, singular moments that follow another, but there is this experience of flow of time, experience that moments melt together without any sharp distinction between them. And also that these singular occurrences or reactions that confront the experience of secondness are not completely random, but that there is conformity to patterns and regularity and order that makes information possible, and also it makes possible to form and it's precisely these patterns and regularities that makes us possible to gain knowledge and information about the reality. So thirdness is a really important category because it makes possible that we can have minds and that there can be information that flows through these categories. So that was the categories in a nutshell, very quickly explained. They are very abstract, quite hard to understand, but try to relate them to your own experience. And, it helps when you are just concentrating and listening to your experience and try to maybe concentrate on first the experiences of firstness or experiences of secondness or experiences of thirdness, and try to little bit see how you feel about those things. It's a creative thing to do. You shouldn't take it too seriously. Couple of very important points. These categories are never separated. Every kind of phenomena, reality, and experience is always a combination of these three categories. The three categories are always interwoven with one another. Nevertheless, no category can be explained with the other two categories. So we need three categories, and three is actually the minimum and maximum number of categories that we need to explain and to categorize our experiences and reality. I will show you in a video where I go through the logic of these categories, why it is so. But very important point is to remember that the categories are always interwoven with another. Everything is always a combination of all the three categories. Now, one last thing. We should not apply these categories formalistically. By that, I mean that we shouldn't see these categories as ends in themselves. We should see these categories as tools to help us in inquiring the world and inquiring our experiences. Also, we should remember that there is always uncertainty in our universe. We can never be 100% sure about some things. All the classifications that we make with these categories are approximations, and there's always this kind of a probability there. We can never be completely sure, and that's okay, but it should be remembered. But hopefully this video made sense. If you have any questions, please leave a comment and please subscribe.